Hello and welcome to another talk of 2026 of Persian Manuscripts Association talk series. We have joined forces with our colleagues at the NoMansLand project, and today we are happy to host Dr. Marc Czarnuszewicz. He is a research fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge. He studied Middle Eastern history at Oxford and St. Andrews and completed his PhD at St. Andrews University in 2024. His research is predominantly focused on Khwarezm-Shahi and Great Seljuq empires, their histories, and neglected textual sources. Today, he's going to walk us through the Waṣāyā of Khaja Niẓām al-Mulk, which was very probably his final advice to his son, Fakhr al-Mulk. Please leave your comments and questions in the chat section. We will have time for Q&A in the end, and we will discuss the questions with Dr. Czarnuszewicz in the end. Please join me to welcome Dr. Czarnuszewicz, sorry, to speak about Great Seljuq traditions under the Ilkhanids and Timurids, the case of the Testament of Niẓām al-Mulk. Marc, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Shiva, and thank you, Shiva and Bruno, for inviting me to talk today. Well, thanks for that introduction. The project I'm going to talk about today is a side project I've been working on for about a year in between finishing my PhD and my postdoc, and it's been to produce an edition and a translation of this text called the Waṣāyā Niẓām al-Mulk, or the Testament of Niẓām al-Mulk. Let's change slides. There we go. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with him, Niẓām al-Mulk was the most famous vizier of the Great Seljuq dynasty. Assassinated in 1092, he served with little interruption for 30 years as vizier to the Seljuq sultans Alp Arslan and Malik Shah. His long period administrating the Great Seljuq Empire coincided with its territorial zenith, stretching from Central Asia to the Levant and Anatolia. Here, for example, is how its extensive borders are represented by Wikipedia. He is associated with an extensive program of scholarly patronage, the founding of an endowed madrasa network named the Nizamiyya, and the building of numerous monuments, including the still extant South Dome of the Masjid-i-Jami in Isfahan. With his grounding in Arabic and Persian letters and pre-Islamic traditions of viziership, he's often credited with allowing the newly arrived Seljuks to successfully administer the many lands they had only recently entered and conquered. This fame means he is often portrayed in modern Turkish TV dramas and films about the Seljuks, typically as a sage elder statesman, as shown here. But a big part of Niẓām al-Mulk's modern fame rests on a text attributed to him known by the title of the Siyasat-nāmeh, or the Book of Politics, or alternatively as the Siyar al-Muluk, or the Qualities of Kings. This is one of the most famous works of mirrors for princes, or advice literature genre, and contains a series of precepts advising the reader on governance and rulership. While known to Western scholarship from at least the mid-19th century, its popularity really took off with the publication of Hubert Darker's edition and translation of the text in 1960, both of which he later revised as further manuscripts emerged. It has now been translated into more than 10 languages, some of the editions of which are shown here, and has become a staple of undergraduate reading lists globally. Much like Machiavelli's The Prince, in some modern contexts, the Siyasat-nāmeh has become almost a self-help book for leaders everywhere, full of pithy maxims with wide applicability. Now, for all its modern popularity, it is, however, a peculiar text. It says very little about how the state had been operating under Niẓām al-Mulk's administration, and most of the text can in fact be taken as a critique of certain Seljuk policies, with the current situation contrasted with the many tales of good rulership from the times of the Seljuks' predecessor dynasties. For this reason, multiple scholars have argued that the work dates from Niẓām al-Mulk's later career, when his rival Taj al-Mulk had temporarily usurped the vizierate from him. A more substantial issue with the al-Satnāmeh are the disputes over its authenticity as a text authored by Niẓām al-Mulk. Prompted by the discordance of themes and writing styles within the text, Boris Zakhoder was the first to suggest that the extant version of the text may in part be the work of a later author. Recently, Alexei Hismatulin has again questioned the text attribution in a series of publications, arguing that the oldest known manuscript of the text is a later forgery, and that the greater part of the text was in fact authored by the famous Seljuq poet Muizzi. Now, both Zakhoder's original and Hismatulin's new arguments remain highly disputed, most recently by Neguin Yavari. This today, however, is not a presentation about the al-Satnāmeh. I have not examined the key manuscripts on which the dispute rests, and I'm not in a position to judge on the number of Hismatulin's contentions. What I do think Hismatulin's arguments demonstrate is the degree of uncertainty around our sources for early Seljuk history. We have particularly few texts connected to the period of their rule before 1100, when their empire was at its zenith. Those which do exist from this period often survive only in later manuscripts and receive no reference in other sources for decades or even centuries after the supposed date of their original composition. Indeed, the skeptical researcher might extend Hismatulin's methodology and claim that a great many other works of supposed early Seljuk provenance are in fact forgeries. Trying to write a meaningful biography of Niẓām al-Mulk in such conditions is a fraught task, with prose sources within half a century of his death particularly thin on the ground. It is this highly uncertain historiographical environment that I wish to introduce the text at the heart of today's talks, the Waṣāyā Niẓām al-Mulk, or Advisory Testament of Niẓām al-Mulk. This is likewise a Persian language mirror for princes, which claims to derive in part from the works of Niẓām al-Mulk himself. But unlike the al-Satnāmeh, which claims to have been penned by Niẓām al-Mulk's own hand, the Waṣāyā states in its introduction that it was compiled by one Fakhr al-Dawla Ḥasan, a descendant of Niẓām al-Mulk, active at least 12 generations distant from him. Fakhr al-Dawla Ḥasan claims that he compiled his Waṣāyā by combining oral family traditions passed down to him with a number of other unspecified written sources. Though we have little biographical information about the author, he does give his lineage in detail in the Waṣāyā's introduction, stating some of the administrative positions which his ancestors held. He tells us that his great-grandfather served the last Ilkhanid ruler, Togha Temür, in the mid-14th century, and that this would place Fakhr al-Dawla Ḥasan's own period of activity sometime in the 15th century, or roughly a little over 3 centuries distant from the lifetime of Niẓām al-Mulk. Fakhr al-Dawla Ḥasan gives us no indication of exactly where he was active, but Togha Temür's rule was focused on Khorasan, and the first historian to cite the Waṣāyā, Marc in his Rawdat al-Safar, was active in 15th century Herat. Fakhr al-Dawla Ḥasan would therefore seem likely to have been a learned bureaucrat, compiling the Waṣāyā as a demonstration of his illustrious lineage, vizierly knowledge, and skill in Persian for the benefit of an unknown ruler or rulers in late Timurid Khorasan in the 15th century. Now, in theory, the Waṣāyā could offer material on Niẓām al-Mulk's court, which was not included in prior histories, despite being compiled over 3 centuries distant from the life of its subject. While these intervening centuries raise obvious questions about its credibility, it should not be dismissed out of hand given the current doubts about the al-Satnāmeh's provenance and the paucity of alternative early Seljuk material. Now, testaments like the Waṣāyā were a popular literary genre even in the earliest periods of Islamic literature. If we try to visualize the place of the testamentary genre, we could view it as a subset of the mirror for princes genre, which advised rulers on proper behavior, which was itself a subgenre of the field of advice literature more generally. Testaments are some of the oldest known works in Arabic prose literature, stretching back to the Ahd al-Bashir, an Arabic translation of a Middle Persian work attributed to the 3rd century founder of the Sasanian Empire and addressed to subsequent Persian rulers. Many further testaments are extant in Arabic and Persian literature in subsequent centuries. The idea of rulers giving instructions to their sons was particularly popular. The 10th century historian Ibn Miskaweh provided an extended quotation from the Buyid ruler Mu'izz al-Dawla to his son Izz al-Dawla in his Arabic history, the Tajarib al-Umam. But probably the most relevant example for today's talk was composed only 10 years before Niẓām al-Mulk's own death, the famous Qaboosnameh. This was composed in New Persian by the former Ziyarid ruler Kayqavus ibn Iskandar to advise his son on rulership. Completed in his old age, this mirror for princes was Kayqavus's testament to his son in all but name. The problem is that more than any other genre, perhaps, testaments were often falsely ascribed to prominent historical figures by authors writing centuries later. We therefore have several extant Waṣāyās ascribed to important Islamic figures like Muhammad, Ali, and the Prophet Luqman, which few modern scholars seriously consider to have been the work of their namesakes. Both scenarios remain plausible, therefore, that on the one hand, Niẓām al-Mulk himself was the author of a Waṣāyā, and on the other, that a later author or authors created a Waṣāyā and ascribed it to Niẓām al-Mulk to take advantage of his fame as a wise vizier. To investigate this, the logical place to start is with the Waṣāyā's healthy manuscript edition. There are more copies of the text extant globally than there are copies of the al-Satnameh, though many of these copies are from the 18th and 19th centuries or are undated. I've been able to examine or obtain imagery of every extant manuscript globally which I've been aware of, excluding the 30 or so copies which are held in Iranian or Iraqi collections. I've attempted to represent how they interrelate with one another by using a stemma system adopted from Bo-Utash's edition of the Misbah al-Urwa. Such a method is, of course, to some degree provisional and misleading in this case, as we have numerous textual variations between manuscripts which appear to have spread horizontally across this diagram rather than vertically, as a genealogical tree implies. Now, the oldest extant manuscript is held at the Istanbul University Rare Books Library and, though undated, is attributable on paleographic grounds to the 15th century, the century in which the Waṣāyā was compiled. There is a small possibility of its being an autograph, but it lacks a colophon or further identifying features in its marginalia. The oldest dated manuscript is Bodleian Fraser 251 from 1541 to 2, the oldest dated manuscript in the branch of textual variations, which I refer to as Gamma. The other manuscript on which I've relied is Khodabaksh Persian 934, apparently the oldest text in the Eta branch. Each of these manuscripts holds a full copy of the text without noticeable lacunae, and together they represent the three major branches of variation in the text manuscript tradition. So these are the three which I've mainly based my research on. Now, there is also the matter of Mergvan's quotation of one of the Waṣāyā's stories in his universal history, Rawdat al-Safa. The oldest dated manuscript of the Rawdat al-Safa was copied under Mergvan's direct supervision in Herat in 1495. In other words, prior to the oldest dated manuscript of the Waṣāyā. Confusingly, this adopts some phrasings from all three main branches, as well as adding considerable additional variations of its own. It cannot fit easily into our schematic diagram, but the majority of its variations come from the beta rather than from the alpha branch. It may either be employing an early version of the text, which our extant manuscripts diverged from at an early stage, or represent Mergvan exercising his authorial prerogative to alter the account stylistically. The other notable point here is the very large number of manuscripts of the Waṣāyā held in British collections. as is well known, British collections of Persian manuscripts disproportionately originate from South Asia. I cannot speak for the manuscripts now held in Iran, but the popularity of the work in Indian contexts is evidenced by the colophons, marginalia, and the worm damage of the majority of the manuscripts which I have seen. The fact that our oldest manuscript, therefore, is held at Istanbul University and has none of these features makes it an interesting outlier. It is also suggestive of the Alpha tradition perhaps having diverged from the other branches in late Timurid Iran, perhaps even reaching Istanbul through war or cultural exchanges between the Ottomans and the Safavids. This is by no means a certain hypothesis, however, as the British Library OR 256 shares a number of the same variations as the Istanbul manuscript, but the British Library manuscript almost certainly came from India. Now, I believe I'm the first to conduct such a survey of the Waṣāyā's manuscript edition, in part because the text has long suffered from a very negative reputation as a source for Seljuk history, a reputation sealed by the typically opinionated Edward Browne. In his literary history of Persia, he is dismissive of its value against that of the Siyasat-nāmeh, calling the Waṣāyā notoriously spurious. By contrast, the most recent scholar to have seriously engaged with the Waṣāyā, Harold C. Bowen in the 1930s, pointed out that events in it match what can be known about the Seljuk period so closely that much of the text could plausibly be the actual utterances of Niẓām al-Mulk. Now, the reason for the difference of opinion between Browne and Bowen stems from how the text was first discovered by Orientalists in the 19th century, while they were hunting for sources on the life of Omar Khayyam. Now, the immense success of the translations of Omar Khayyam's quatrains by Edward Fitzgerald in the mid-19th century brought a great deal of critical attention to the work and the life of Omar Khayyam itself. In his biographical sketch of Khayyam and his introduction to his translations of the quatrains, Fitzgerald introduces what he termed the tale of the free schoolfellows. In this tale, Omar Khayyam attends school as a youth in the city of Nishapur, alongside Niẓām al-Mulk and the future Ismaili Dai Ḥasan Sabah. The free make a pact that if one of them achieved success, he would aid the other two. Niẓām al-Mulk is appointed vizier and aids Omar Khayyam in his scientific work, but is also forced to aid Ḥasan Sabah, who causes great trouble for the Seljuk Empire by intriguing to promote Ismailism and heresy. Fitzgerald appears to have viewed the tale as historical fact and gave a translation of this story based on the version appearing in the Rawdat al-Safa of Marc, which was very popular with both Islamic copyists and 19th century Orientalists alike. Now, in the Rawdat al-Safa, Marc attributes the story to the Waṣāyā and follows its version relatively closely. How it was only later, when Orientalists discovered manuscripts of the Waṣāyā itself, that they realized that it was a work compiled by a distant descendant of Niẓām al-Mulk in the 15th century, as we've discussed, rather than the vizier himself. And thus it required its reputation as a spurious work, in Browne's words. As a result, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak, and further study of the text and its many other stories was issued in favour of work on the Siyasat-nāmeh. The one great exception to this rule is Harold C. Bowen's article on the tale and the Waṣāyā, an excellent work of scholarship, even reading it now, almost 100 years late since its publication. Bowen tracked the tale through earlier sources and noted that two versions appeared in histories written in the Ilkhanid period, Rashid al-Din's Jawami al-Tawarikh and Hamd al-Mustawfi's Tarikh al-Ghazideh. Bowen understood the version of the tale which appears in both of these sources as deriving from the non-extant Ismaili work, the Sarguzasht Sayyidina. In its original form, the tale celebrates the Ismaili Dai Ḥasan Sabah in the story, rather than Niẓām al-Mulk, and Bowen shows that the Waṣāyā refashioned the story as it appeared in Rashid al-Din to make Niẓām al-Mulk the protagonist. Bowen believed that it was excluded from the other Ilkhanid history which makes use of the Sargozasht, Giovanni's famous Tariq Jahan Goshar, because Giovanni regarded it as part of an extraneous tradition discordant with other portions of Ḥasan Sabbah's biography. The problem with the story which Bowen, Browne, and perhaps Giovanni recognized is that the protagonists were of quite different ages, Niẓām al-Mulk being several decades older than Omar Khayyam and Ḥasan Sabbah, and thus highly unlikely to have been their classmate. There have been several attempts to solve this issue by understanding the protagonists involved to have been switched in succeeding centuries. Martinus Hootsma and Edward Denison Ross therefore argued that the vizier involved was not Niẓām al-Mulk, but the later Seljuk vizier Anushirvan ibn Khalid, who was reported as having had a classmate who later turned heretic. Bowen countered this by arguing that Anushirvan was too young to have been a classmate of Ḥasan Sabbah, and counters that the tale would best fit if the three protagonists were Niẓām al-Mulk, his fellow Seljuk vizier al-Kunduri, and the poet al-Baharzi. The latter two were definitely classmates in Nishapur. Al-Kunduri was one of Niẓām al-Mulk's most enduring rivals, while al-Baharzi was the recipient of his patronage. The only problem with Bowen's rendering is that it is hard to understand how the tale found its way in such heavily modified form into the Ismaili work, the Sargozasht Sayyidina, in the first place, if the Ismaili leader Ḥasan Sabbah was never part of the original lineup. For understanding the Waṣāyā as a source, though, the question of the original basis of the story is actually rather irrelevant. Textual analysis shows that Bowen was correct and that its version of the tale depends on that of Rashid al-Din, with several small details in the two stories and some language matching closely. The fact that the Waṣāyā was using Rashid al-Din as a source does not make the text spurious, but merely shows Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan, its compiler, as using every available textual source exactly in the manner he explains in his introduction. We should therefore judge the credibility of each story in the Waṣāyā on its individual merits and determine, in each case, the extent to which a story is the product of family oral tradition, written sources, and Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan's own invention. Now, for a family tradition to have somehow survived the 12 generations which separated Niẓām al-Mulk from Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan may seem to stretch the bounds of credulity, though the 19th century Orientalist Hermann Effe, one of the few historians to speak positively of the text, did consider it possible. What makes it more likely is that a Waṣāyā attributed to Niẓām al-Mulk appears to have been in circulation long before Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan compiled his 15th century version. The earliest reference to such a work comes in the ethical text, the Maqarim al-Akhlaq of Razi ad-Din al-Nishapuri, who died in 1201-2. This mentions a Waṣāyā Niẓām of Niẓām al-Mulk and quotes a short passage from it about the importance of striving. A further reference to a Waṣāyā comes slightly later in Sadid al-Din Awfi's Giovanni al-Hikayat, which briefly references the fact that Niẓām al-Mulk composed the Waṣāyā Niẓām to advise his son and quotes a single passage. In addition to these two references, another apparently entirely separate Waṣāyā survives in two majmuas in Istanbul. They both contain a short text of only a few folios in length, but which bears the title Waṣāyā Niẓām and is attributed to Niẓām al-Mulk. It survives firstly in the Nafiz Pasha manuscript as part of a compilation of ethical texts called the Hirad Niẓām, and was published. The origins of this manuscript are highly debated, but it seems to come from the 12th century and was published in full by Mansur Sarvat. A second copy of this Waṣāyā Niẓām survives in a Korprulu manuscript datable to 1356, and Ali Safari Akala has published a critical edition which employs both of these manuscripts. The key point, though, is that the short Waṣāyā Niẓām preserved in these two manuscripts does not match any part of the Waṣāyā compiled by Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan in the 15th century, nor the two early references we saw on the previous slide. In other words, a text named the Waṣāyā was in circulation within a century of Niẓām al-Mulk's death, but we can't be sure whether these short witnesses are fragments of a single Waṣāyā or evidence that multiple texts of that name were circulating at the same time. The idea that Fakhr al-Din Ḥasan may have based his work on some of this early material is therefore eminently plausible. So let's turn to the structure of Fakhr al-Din Ḥasan's compilation itself. The structure of his text looks broadly like this. It has an introduction, a frame story on Niẓām al-Mulk's youth up to the composition of the Waṣāyā, then two long chapters of advice, one on reasons not to take up the vizierate, and a second on how to behave if one chooses to take it up. These chapters are illustrated by a variety of tales. It depends slightly on what you count as a tale and what is a mere anecdote, but the rough origin of the longer stories is shown here. Slightly over half of the tales tell story from the Seljuq era, while the remainder tell of the affairs of pre-Seljuq dynasties, especially the Ghaznavids. Of course, this structure and the significant number of tales which originate from before the Seljuq era is very reminiscent of the Siyasatnameh. This, as shown here, was also split into two parts, which were in turn composed of numerous chapters on different aspects of administration, with most illustrated by historical tales. You can see a broad summary of the origin of the stories in the Siyasatnameh here, counting just longer stories rather than shorter anecdotes. There are also some differences, of course, such as a distinct lack of Seljuq tales in the Siyasatnameh and a much greater number of pre- or early Islamic stories. Only one event features in both texts, that of the capture of the Safarid Amir Amr ibn Layth by the Samanid Amir Ismail. The fact that the Waṣāyā adopts a similar structure and story pattern to the Siyasatnameh is perhaps unsurprising. Fakhr al-Din Ḥasan was working in an environment where the latter text was already renowned, and the adoption of this structure may have offered his compilation a familiarity, an authenticity, and a popularity in circles in which the Siyasatnameh was already popular. Indeed, his introduction makes plain that the structure of the text is his own invention, as a means of organizing the material he had collected from disparate sources. The origin of both the stories and the precepts themselves, therefore, must be examined case by case. Looking at the Waṣāyā's tales in detail, the logical place to start is with the frame story of the text. This weaves together a narrative of Niẓām al-Mulk's childhood and upbringing to explain how he came to dictate the testament to his son, Fakhr al-Mulk. Niẓām al-Mulk's father is presented as a pious tax collector in Tus, while his mother is described as being descended from a line of viziers. His birth accompanies the end of a drought in the region. 2 days after his birth, his mother tells a story of seeing Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, in a dream. Fatima tells her to name her child Ḥasan and suckles him herself. The narrative jumps forward to Niẓām al-Mulk's studies in Dabiristan at the age of 11. Not only is he extraordinarily able, he develops a system of tutoring among his class to ensure all the students learn to recite correctly. When Niẓām al-Mulk was a young man, we hear that his father suffered financial troubles, the only solution to which was to defer the taxes of the nobility of Tus for several years. Niẓām al-Mulk sees this as dishonorable and announces his intention to leave Tus for Bukhara to further his education. As he journeys, he passes the village of Meyhana, the base of the Sufi sheikh Abu Sa'id ibn Ali al-Khair. The sheikh sends his dervishes to greet Niẓām al-Mulk as the master of this world and of the hereafter. He treats him with great respect and tells him that when he gains power, he must ensure that patronage is always given to those deserving of it, for his life will come to an end when this patronage stops. We are told how Niẓām al-Mulk quickly went from education to political success on the advice of someone named Abu Ali Shahdan, and served as an excellent vizier to both Alp Arslan and Malik Shah. Much later, Niẓām al-Mulk falls ill at Esfahan, and after recovering, checks the disbursement of patronage from the treasury. He discovers that the patronage of the worthy has stopped, remembered the sheikh's words, and knows that his life will soon come to an end. He summons his son, Fakhr al-Mulk, into his presence and narrates his counsels to guide his son, encouraging him to avoid taking up the vizierate in the first chapter and explaining how he should behave if he does take up the vizierate in the second. Now, the tale is extraordinarily rich, but as with the tale of the Free School Fellows, it contains elements which can be quickly dismissed. Most simply, Meyhana is not on the road from Tus to Bukhara. The date of the Waṣāyā's narration by Niẓām al-Mulk is also given in this story as 487 Hijri, when we know from other sources that Niẓām al-Mulk in fact died 2 years earlier. When we place it against two much earlier accounts of Niẓām al-Mulk's youth and early career, that of Ibn Funduk's Tarikh-e-Bayhaq and Ibn al-Athir's al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, we see both contradiction and confirmation. As in the Waṣāyā, Niẓām al-Mulk is praised by Ibn Funduk as being born at an auspicious time and being an exceptionally able youth. Ibn Funduk also tells of Niẓām al-Mulk's father getting into grave financial difficulties as a tax collector. The moral emphasis on generosity is the same, but in Ibn Funduk's tale, it is attributed to Niẓām al-Mulk's father, who is exceptionally generous even to the state official who is persecuting him. Ibn al-Athir's tale, though, is quite different from that of the Waṣāyā, but it does also attribute Niẓām al-Mulk's entry into the Seljuq service to the same Abu Ali Shādan. The pattern continues in the Waṣāyā's other tales of there having a real basis in previous historical accounts, but with a notably more didactic, moralistic and fabulistic aspect than we might find in a source like Ibn al-Athir. This continues if we look at its tales on the Ghaznavid and Samanid dynasties. As we've noted, its inclusion of tales of the Ghaznavids and Samanids likely responds to the story patterns of the al-Satnāme. Yet whereas that text relates tales about a variety of Ghaznavid rulers, including Sebutagin, Ibrahim and Ma'sūd, the Waṣāyā is entirely centered on the reign of Mahmud of Ghaznā. In all likelihood, this choice is reflective of the 15th century environment in which the compiler Fakhruddin Ḥasan was working. By this time, over 3 centuries distant, Mahmud's reputation far exceeded that of all other members of his dynasty, thanks not just to his conquests and patronage, but the romantic tales around his relationship with his courtier Ayars. With voluminous material available about him, and his character being well known to readers, the extensive coverage of his reign in the Waṣāyā is hardly unsurprising. Yet many of these tales do not deal that closely with the Mahmud of legend at all, and Ayars is not mentioned even once. Instead, these stories largely focus on little-known figures at his court, especially the rivalries between ministers and generals. For example, there is an extended tale on the conflict between the vizier Abu al-Abbas al-Isfaraini and the Amir Ali Hishovand. We know both to have been figures at Mahmud's court who feature in histories of the period, but neither would have been especially familiar even to an educated 15th century audience. Moreover, the narrative names and identifies many more minor figures, such as an envoy from the Sultan to the vizier and one of the vizier's previous employers. It is this level of gratuitous and narratively superfluous detail which would suggest that the compiler Fakhruddin Ḥasan is working from source material rather than simply inventing a tale to edify his audience. We see a similar picture when it comes to tales from the Seljuq period. For the most part, the Waṣāyā is spot on in giving an accurate historical context to its tales. Unlike the al-Satnāme, which only rarely actually discusses the internal affairs and history of the Great Seljuq Empire, the Waṣāyā has frequent allusions to Seljuq politics and relations between family members and other major figures. What is more, these allusions broadly match what we know about these relationships from other sources. The most interesting of these allusions concerns Malik Shah's sons, Berk-Yaruq and Mahmud. Immediately prior to the tale of the Free School Fellows, Niẓām al-Mulk complains of Malik Shah's decision to appoint his young son Mahmud as crown prince at the instigation of the Sultanic Haram, when Berk-Yaruq would in fact have made a much more capable ruler. Other historical sources paint a similar picture, telling us that Malik Shah's wife, and Niẓām al-Mulk's arch-rival, Turkan Khatun, had her son Mahmud proclaimed as Sultan on Malik Shah's death in 1092, whereas Niẓām al-Mulk's sons and retainers supported Berk-Yaruq. These conflicts instigated the First Seljuk Civil War, which was to rack the empire for the next 20 years. This anecdote's apparently accurate prediction of future events therefore makes it unlikely that we are dealing with Niẓām al-Mulk's own words here. But it does speak to the accuracy of the sources used by Fakhr al-Din Ḥasan in compiling the Waṣāyā. We see the same level of detail in other Seljuk tales, including references to Niẓām al-Mulk's close relations to Shafi'i religious leaders and to various military campaigns, all of which are superficially convincing and accurate. We see something similar with regard to arguably the Waṣāyā's most edifying tale, which concerns Niẓām al-Mulk's role in arranging the Byzantine tribute in the aftermath of the Battle of Manzikert. For those of you less familiar with it, at the Battle of Manzikert of 1071, the Seljuks under Alp Arslan were victorious over the Byzantine Emperor Romanos Diogenes, capturing him and opening up Anatolia for Turkish expansion and Islamization. Its significance as a historical turning point in civilizational clash has provoked fascination for centuries by everyone from Western historians to Greek and Turkish nationalists. As a result, the historiography of the battle has been much better studied than that of almost any other event in Seljuk history. For our purposes, what is really useful are two works which summarize the different accounts of the battle in Islamic sources by Karel Hillenbrand on the one hand and Farrukh Sumer and Ali Savim on the other. Thanks to their work, we can easily compare the Waṣāyā's account against other sources to investigate how Fakhr ad-Din Ḥasan may have used them in his compilation process. Now, the Waṣāyā's story of the battle is multi-layered and complex. We're told that the Byzantine emperor had gathered all the Christians together, including the Franks, and that they planned to invade the lands of Islam and replace the caliph with a priest. The Sultan defeats the emperor, and he is brought to him in captivity. The emperor then persuades the Sultan to release him to stop a rival emperor taking over Byzantium, and promises to send a large tribute to the Sultan in exchange. The emperor is released, and the tribute is transported from Byzantium to Alp Arslan's base at Marv. At that time, Alp Arslan's young son Malik Shah is in charge of Ray, governing there with the assistance of an official named Amid Mansur. When the Byzantine tribute party passes through Ray on the way to Marv, Amid Mansur orders for their goods to be investigated. He takes all of the garments which are white in colour for himself and threatens the prince in charge of the tribute party into not telling anyone. Niẓām al-Mulk is suspicious when the party arrives in Marv and notices that there are no white garments. The Byzantines give a cryptic response, while the Amid claims that white is not a colour, a claim which Niẓām al-Mulk finds illogical. He investigates further, but at first finds no documentation for white garments. Niẓām al-Mulk then learns that the queen of the Byzantines has herself sent gifts to the wife of the Sultan. He dispatches an envoy to the Haram to hunt for documentation, which at that time is cited at some pasture land near Tus for the healthy environment there. At the Haram, the envoy obtains an inventory of the tribute, which shows that white garments were included. And Niẓām al-Mulk uses this information to force the prince of Byzantium to tell him what happened. To prevent any ill effects of the scandal coming to Malik Shah, Niẓām al-Mulk demands the return of the garments in a subtle quatrain addressed to the Amid. The tale is very unlikely to be a lost account of Romanos's real tribute after the Battle of Manzikert. Romanos was in fact deposed shortly after his release from Alp Arslan's custody. But there is some clear historical basis for part of the tale in previous narratives of Manzikert. The idea of the Byzantines sending Alp Arslan tribute features in the 13th century accounts of Ibn al-Athiyah, Sibd ibn al-Jawzi, and al-Husayni's Akhbar al-Dawla al-Saljuqiyya, as well as in the 14th century Jawarmi al-Tawarikh of Rashid al-Din. And the idea of Romanos arguing that he should be released so the Byzantines do not replace him with a hostile ruler is also common. The idea that Romanos intended to replace the caliph with a priest also appears in the Akhbar al-Dawla al-Saljuqiyya, as well as in the later history of Marc. The rest of the tribute tale, however, has no parallel in any Seljuk source which I have been able to examine. Elements of it are also very plausible. We do know that Alp Arslan returned to the far east of his empire almost immediately after Manzikert. We do know that there were Seljuk royal encampments in the vicinity of Tus, and we know that Niẓām al-Mulk had rivals in the Seljuk administration. As for the fascinating idea of queenly diplomacy occurring between a Byzantine queen and the Seljuk harem, to my mind this would seem more plausible in a later environment like 13th century Anatolia, where Seljuk queens like the famous Gurji Khatun had Christian heritage and might usefully serve as vectors for intercultural exchanges. It may also make sense as an invention of the 14th or 15th centuries, given the well-studied power of queens and the independence of their encampments under the Ilkhans and their successors. That said, little enough is known about the lives of early Seljuk queens for it to be difficult to dismiss as a later tale out of hand. To conclude, the problem of the Waṣāyā is of how to employ it as a historical source, to weigh its perspective on events against that of other sources, and to try and determine from where it is deriving its information. In the context of the weakness of other materials on Niẓām al-Mulk's life and the early Seljuk period in general, it has the potential to be a source of great value, though the anachronistic, hagiographical, and narratological elements of its stories offer significant discouragement for those attempting to employ it. This said, sources suffering similar problems have successfully been used by other historians. To take but one example, C.E. Bosworth used the notoriously unreliable Tadqirat al-Shu'ara of the 15th century writer Dawlat Shah in his study of the later Ghaznavids. I do not claim that one should use any 15th century source to study the 11th century without employing a great deal of caution, only that to continue with the effective status quo of ignoring the Waṣāyā is untenable in light of the rich detail it can offer and the very real possibility it preserves information from earlier sources which are lost to us. The Waṣāyā should be treated like a hadith with a weak isnad, unreliable on its own, but potentially a corroborating piece of evidence when used in conjunction with other sources. And if the proof of a work of advice literature is not historical accuracy, but a capacity to edify and communicate moral messages, then the Waṣāyā is most certainly the match of the Siyasatnameh. It is the Waṣāyā's tale of the Free School Fellows which prefaces Fitzgerald's version of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, and therefore typically features in more popular portrayals of Omar Khayyam's life, like this 1957 film. As an enduring tribute to the craft of storytelling in New Persian literature, the Waṣāyā's legacy is undeniable. Thank you.